Hi, everyone. So as you read about in the email I sent you, although I've avoided COVID for 2 years, it finally caught up with me, and I was diagnosed with it last week, tested positive. I started getting symptoms after last class. I'm past the worst of it. I'm not 100% yet. My brain's still a little foggy. So if I'm a little bit slow or not explaining things as well, that would be why, but I'm going to try to do my best today anyway. Other than that, I'm feeling not too bad. Excuse me. Keep in mind that this is the last week of class before spring break, which is next week. Obviously, there's no classes during spring break. And exam 2 is the first day back after spring break, which I know kind of sucks. But that's just kind of how the timing worked out this semester. So keep that in mind, that the next exam is 2 weeks from today. Also keep in mind that if you got the syllabus from Canvas, for whatever reason, Canvas messes up the formatting. Whenever I upload a syllabus, it messes up the formatting, and it starts to look like the exams are on different days than they actually are. So don't go off the Canvas syllabus. If you have a hard copy of the syllabus, that's going to be accurate. The Canvas one may or may not be. So keep in mind that exam 2 is 2 weeks from today, which is the 7th of March, I believe. Okay, you're responsible for everything since exam 1 up to the end of Wednesday's class. So I believe that's going to be the last few slides on the self. Then it's going to be social cognition, attributions, attitudes, and then we're going to start talking about cognitive dissonance theory today. Also keep in mind that partly due to the fact that I got COVID last week, I'm a little bit slower in getting the exam 1 extra credit up into Canvas. I will be posting that shortly. It just took a little bit longer just because I was under the weather at the end of last week, so I couldn't take care of that. But I will get that up there shortly, so rest assured you will see your points there. Okay, so let's get started then. We have to finish up a couple slides looking at attitudes, then we're going to start into a new topic. So let's get that underway. Okay. So I'd introduced the concept of attitudes last class. And one of the reasons that we study attitudes as social psychologists is because that would appear to be the best way to predict people's behavior, which is one of the ultimate goals of social psychology. So for instance, if I wanted to predict if you were going to buy Pepsi when you go to the grocery store, when you go shopping, how am I going to do that? Well, one way to do that, presumably, is to measure your attitudes towards Pepsi. And if you have very strong, favorable attitudes towards Pepsi, I could predict that you're going to buy Pepsi at the store. That makes a lot of sense, right? So the basic assumption of a lot of this research is that the attitudes that we have influence our later behavior, which makes a lot of sense, that assumption, right? It's partly for this reason that Gordon Allport, who's a big name in the field of social psychology, stated in 1954 that the attitude is the most distinctive and important concept in contemporary American social psychology. Okay? Because if you know people's attitudes, we can then predict their behaviors. But there was a problem, because although this basic assumption seems obvious that our attitudes influence our behaviors, another researcher by the name of Alan Wicker reviewed all the research that had been done up to that point, looking at the relationship between people's attitudes and their behaviors. And he came to the surprising conclusion that there was little evidence to support the postulated existence of stable underlying attitudes within individuals, which influence both his or her verbal expressions and his or her actions. So what Wicker is saying is two things, really. First off, that there's very little relationship between what people's stated attitudes are and their later behavior, which is surprising enough. But moreover, he's also stating that there doesn't even seem to be evidence that supports the very existence of attitudes in the first place, at least not attitudes that are stable. Okay? And so this kind of threw the field into a bit of disarray. In fact, partly on the basis of his findings and partly for numerous other reasons, the field of social psychology entered into a state of crisis in the 1970s, where social psychologists were concerned about the future of the field because not even the most basic assumption that attitudes are related to behaviors seems to have any empirical evidence for it. Now, that crisis was eventually resolved, and part of the reason it was resolved it was for numerous reasons, but part of the reason is because we started to do additional research to figure out the conditions under which attitudes were related to behaviors. And we started to realize that a lot of the studies that had been done, that Wicker had reviewed, that had led him to this conclusion, were flawed in certain ways. And once we started to look at the question in a more appropriate manner, we started to realize that there was, in fact, a relationship between attitudes and behaviors. So that's what I want to focus on for the next 20 minutes or so, is on what are those conditions under which attitudes are linked, are related to people's behaviors. First off, let me describe to you one of the studies that Wicker reviewed that led him to the conclusion that there is no relationship between attitudes and behaviors. And this is a kind of a famous study in social psychology. In this study, a researcher by the name of Lapierre went around the United States with a Chinese couple. And they visited various establishments like restaurants and campgrounds, things like that, and hotels. And they went to 250 places in the course of their trip. And despite the fact that at the time when they did this, this was back in like the 30s, I believe. At the time they did this, there was widespread discrimination against the Chinese. Despite that fact, they were served in 249 out of 250 places. Only one place ever refused them service because there was a Chinese couple there, okay? When they got back from this trip around the US, Lapierre mailed all the owners of these 250 establishments a questionnaire that asked them a number of things, including, would you serve a Chinese person at your establishment? And when he got the responses back from these places, what he found is that over 90% of them said that they would refuse service. But how's that the case? I mean, if you look at people's attitudes, which is that the overwhelming majority said they would not serve a Chinese person, but if you then you look at their behavior, the overwhelming majority of people did in fact serve a Chinese person. Those things don't relate, right? There's no relationship between people's stated attitudes and their behaviors. And there were a number of studies like this one that came to similar conclusions, that people's attitudes didn't really relate to their behaviors. So for instance, there was a study that asked people about their attitude towards religion, right? Are you in favor or against organized religion? And then they looked at behaviors, things like how often they went to church. And what they showed is that there's very little relationship between people's opinions towards religion and whether they went to church or not. So that's just another example of a study that showed very little relationship between people's attitudes and behaviors. So why is that the case? Well, first off, note that this study in particular, the Lapierre study that he toured the US with a Chinese couple, is flawed in numerous respects. So for instance, when he mailed out the questionnaires, we don't know whether the people who responded to those questionnaires, who said they would refuse service, we don't know that those are the same people who actually made the decision as to whether to allow or whether to serve Lapierre and the Chinese couple. We don't know if they're the same people, obviously. But regardless, future studies started to uncover conditions under which attitudes and behaviors were in fact linked. So let's take a look at what those conditions are. Maybe the most important condition under which attitudes are related to behaviors is that an attitude has to be measured at the same level of specificity as the behavior. There has to be correspondence. Here's what I mean by that. When you're measuring a behavior, you're usually measuring a very specific behavior, right? And if you want an attitude to be able to predict that behavior, you need to measure the attitude at the same level of specificity. So what happened in the Lapierre study is that he asked a very general attitude question, which is, would you serve a Chinese person? But that wasn't actually the behavior that they were measuring. They were measuring whether they would serve a well-dressed Chinese couple accompanied by an American professor in their establishment, not just a Chinese person. Okay? There was a much more specific behavior they were measuring. And so as a general rule, a very general attitude is not going to predict a specific behavior very well. If you want to predict a specific behavior, you've got to ask the attitude question at the same level of specificity. So in the Lapierre study, they should have asked something like, would you serve a well-dressed Chinese couple accompanied by an American professor, if that's the behavior that they're actually measuring? And it's for this reason that that religion study I mentioned earlier also showed no relationship between attitudes and behaviors. Because what they had done is they had measured people's general attitudes in religion, but they measured a very specific behavior of whether they went to church on Sunday. Okay. If you want to be able to predict if people are going to go to church on Sunday, you don't measure their general attitudes towards religion. What you do is you measure their attitudes towards going to church on Sunday, right? So you've got to measure the attitude at that same level of specificity. If you don't, there won't be a relationship between attitudes and behaviors. So just to give you another example of this, what researchers did in the study is they had a number of women in the study, and they randomly assigned women to one of 4 conditions. So first off, they asked each woman an attitude question related to using birth control. And then they measured whether the women themselves used birth control over the next 2 years. But specifically what they did is they asked them one of 4 different variations of the attitude question that varied in terms of its level of specificity. So let me show you what I mean. So 1/4 of the women were asked what their attitude was towards birth control, which is a very general question. Then they measured, as I mentioned, whether these women used birth control pills over the next 2 years, which is a very specific behavior. And you can measure the relationship between attitude and behavior using a correlation coefficient. Remember, that's a lowercase r. And if you recall, a correlation coefficient is a number that varies between -1 and +1. And the closer that number is to 0, the weaker the relationship is. So what they showed here, for instance, is that if you ask women, what is your attitude towards birth control? And you correlate that with whether these women use birth control pills over the next 2 years, you find very little relationship between those two. In other words, attitudes are not predicting behaviors in this case because this number is really close to 0. So what the researchers did is a second group of women, they asked them a slightly different attitude question. They asked them, what is your attitude towards birth control pills? That's a slightly more specific question, right? And it brings it a little bit more in line with the behavior they're actually measuring, which is whether the woman would use birth control pills over the next 2 years. And because they're bringing the attitude question more in line with the behavior that they're measuring, the correlation goes up. And now we see that people's attitudes are predicting their behaviors a little bit. It's only 0.3 or so. It's not a huge amount, but it's something. And so a third group of women were asked an even more specific question. What is your attitude towards using birth control pills? Which again, brings the attitude question even more in line with their behavior. And what we see is that the correlation goes up. Okay, so now we're seeing that attitudes really are predicting behaviors. And then a fourth group of women were asked the most specific question. What is your attitude towards using birth control pills during the next 2 years? Which is the exact behavior that they're actually measuring. And when you measure the attitude at the same level as the behavior, that's when you get the highest association. Okay, the strongest association. This is when attitudes are really being able to predict behaviors. So what had happened in the past research that Alan Wicker had reviewed is that most of the studies were doing something like in this top row here, where the researchers were asking very general questions and measuring a very specific behavior and finding very little relationship. So if you want to be able to predict a behavior, you need to measure the attitude at the same level of specificity as that behavior. That's the key takeaway here. A second condition under which attitudes predict behaviors is something known as the principle of aggregation. Now, here's the thing. Because we're a little bit behind because of the extra credit opportunity, and because this concept is kind of complex, I'm not going to go into detail on this, okay? I'm not going to ask any questions on the exam related to the principle of aggregation. So I'm going to give you like the 15-second version, but then I'm not going to come back to it just because we just don't have time to get into this overly complex thing. But the basic idea here is that if you're using a very general attitude to predict behaviors, so for instance, let's say you know people's attitudes towards the environment. That's a very general attitude, and that can relate to a whole host of behaviors. It can relate to whether you recycle next week, to whether you want to increase fines for littering, to whether you sign petitions to end fracking, whatever. There's a ton of those behaviors, right? A general attitude doesn't predict a specific behavior, as we just saw, right? So what happens is you have to take a whole bunch of different behaviors and add them all up into this behavioral index. And now a general attitude will predict how many of those behaviors people engage in, but they don't predict a specific behavior all that well. That being said, that's all I'm going to say about that. You don't need to know that for the exam. So the next slide that you have in your notes, you can ignore that slide. It has a bunch of statistics on it. Just ignore it. It just gets too complex to really get into at the moment. Okay, so a third condition under which attitudes predict behaviors. And this is, I probably mislabeled this. This should really say a lack of social influence. Because what this means is that if you were to, for instance, ask people their attitudes in public, people may not want to admit to certain attitudes in front of other people. Remember that people have this social desirability bias, right? We want to appear like we're good people, so we don't want to admit to things that we're embarrassed to, things like that. So if you're answering an attitude question in front of other people, what that means is you might lie to me about what your attitude is. And if you're lying to me, then your attitudes aren't going to predict your behaviors. So what that means is that if we want to increase the attitude behavior link, then we need to measure attitudes in a way that minimizes or eliminates social influence. So one way to do that, of course, is to make sure that you're not asking people about their attitudes in front of others, right? But there are other mechanisms that people have come up with as well to minimize social influence. And one of those mechanisms is by using what's known as a bogus pipeline. And a bogus pipeline is basically a fake lie detector. Here's how it works. So imagine, this is a study that looked at this. So imagine you're a participant, you show up to my lab, and I tell you that what I'm going to be doing to you is I'm going to ask you a series of questions about what your attitudes are, but you're not going to answer me out loud. What you're going to do is you're going to grab onto this wheel that's attached to the wall, like a steering wheel. You're going to grab onto that. You're going to try to hold it as steady as possible. And that wheel is hooked up to a computer. And basically what happens is that if I ask you a question, like what's your opinion on capital punishment? If you are for something, then we know that you're going to rotate your hands very, very slightly clockwise. And if you're against something, you're going to rotate your hands very, very slightly counterclockwise. It's just an unconscious process that happens, and the computer's going to pick up on that. And the computer is therefore going to basically tell me what your true attitude is. And you're a little skeptical maybe of this, but okay, you're going to try it out. So you grab onto this wheel, and I give you the first topic. So think about what your attitude is towards capital punishment. And you don't say anything out loud, you just think it, and you're holding the wheel as steady as possible. And then I look at my computer, I do some calculations, and I say, okay, it looks like you are pro-capital punishment. Okay, and you think, okay, well, I'm pro-capital punishment. Okay, but you could have just guessed that, so try another one. So now you grab onto the wheel again, you're really concentrating to make sure you're not moving the wheel at all. And I say, okay, what's your attitude towards abortion? Okay, and you try to keep it as steady as possible. And then I read the computer, and I say, okay, you are against abortion. And you're against abortion. So again, I seem to have predicted your attitude, right? And I do this repeatedly over and over and over. And every time I say some sort of topic, the computer is telling me what your true attitude is. So you now believe that this machine can effectively read your mind, right? Now, what you don't know, or what you have forgotten, is that about 6 months ago, you participated in this giant mass testing session with like hundreds of other people, where you answered like questionnaires for an hour. And a couple of the questions in that questionnaire were things like, what is your attitude towards capital punishment? What is your attitude towards abortion? And so basically, I've accessed your answers that you gave me 6 months ago, and I'm just reading them back to you. There's no such thing as like your hands move clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on if you're for or against position. That's not a real thing. All I'm doing is reading back to you what the answers are, what your attitudes are that you told me 6 months ago, but you've forgotten. But you don't realize that. So from your perspective, it looks like this machine can read your mind, okay? So then what happens is that now when I can ask you questions about your attitudes I'm really interested in, you're much less likely to lie to me. Because why would you lie to me? If this thing can read your mind, then there's no point in lying to me, because I'm going to be able to tell from the wheel what your true attitude is. So by convincing you that this thing can detect your lies, it encourages you to be more honest. And if you're more honest, then that means I'm getting your true attitudes. And therefore, those attitudes are going to be more likely to predict your behaviors. Okay, so we can use the bogus pipeline in order to get people's true attitudes, is the main idea. And finally, a fourth condition under which attitudes predict behaviors is when those attitudes are strong. So you can imagine that you have a really strong attitude towards Pepsi. You love Pepsi, and like Coke makes you want to vomit, right? So Pepsi is all you want to drink. If you have a really strong attitude, then I'm pretty confident that when you go to the store, you're going to buy Pepsi, right? Your attitude is going to predict your behavior, no problem. Even if like Coke is on sale, right? Even if Coke is half price, it doesn't matter, because I know you hate Coke, you love Pepsi, you're willing to pay extra for Pepsi. However, let's say you have only a weak attitude positive attitude towards Pepsi. You like Pepsi a little bit more than Coke, but it's pretty close. Doesn't really matter all that much to you. Well, in that case, maybe you go to the store and when you get there, Coke is on sale and you figure, well, you might as well get Coke if it's a little bit cheaper, right? So now your attitude, which you said was pro Pepsi, didn't predict your behavior, which is that you bought Coke because it was on sale, right? But the only reason it didn't predict your behavior is because you didn't really have that strong of an attitude in the first place. And so strong attitudes predict behaviors very well. Weak attitudes don't predict behaviors very well. And that's all I have to say about attitudes. Let me first off ask if there are any questions before I move on to a new topic. And I'm not seeing anything. Okay, so when this research was done, psychologists figured out that in fact, attitudes are related to behaviors under these conditions, if you measure them at the same level of specificity, if you minimize social influence, if they're strong attitudes, etc. And as I said, that partly resolved the sort of crisis that was happening in social psychology by demonstrating that our initial assumption that attitudes are related to behaviors is in fact correct under the right circumstances. Okay, so if there's no other questions, I'm going to start a new topic. So one of the assumptions of attitude research generally is that there's a unidirectional influence here, meaning that you develop an attitude towards something and that influences the behaviors that you engage in, right? So you have the attitude first, and then later you have the behaviors that are consistent with that attitude. In the 1950s into 1960s, there was a stream of research that argued that the opposite can also happen as well. That in fact, not only do attitudes lead to behaviors, but in fact, the behaviors we engage in can lead us to adopt attitudes that are consistent with those behaviors. It kind of reverses the normal way that we think about those things. In particular, the most famous of these is cognitive dissonance theory. This is, in my opinion, maybe the most influential and famous social psychology theory that there is. In fact, just yesterday, I came across two different sources that mentioned cognitive dissonance theory outside of academia. So someone mentioned it on the news and someone mentioned it in an article that I was reading, just coincidentally. It's become so popular that it's sort of transcended social psychology, and it's kind of, the term has become part of the mainstream in a sense. So I'm going to tell you how it developed and what it means and what its implications are, because this is, as I said, one of the most important theories in all of social psychology, in part because of the numerous implications that it has. So here's the basic idea. By the way, I'll mention that cognitive dissonance theory was created by a guy by the name of Leon Festinger, who is the same guy who created social comparison theory, which is often called like the second most famous theory in social psychology. So this one guy alone has like the top two most famous theories in social psychology, obviously a very important figure in social psychology. Okay, so here's the basic idea. We have at any given time a number of attitudes and thoughts and beliefs, and we generally want those things to be consistent. And we want our behaviors to also be consistent with our attitudes and our thoughts and our beliefs. In other words, you don't want to say one thing and do another, because then you'd be a hypocrite, right? You don't want to say you're an honest person, but you cheat on your taxes, because those things don't really mesh together. So we really like it when all of our thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors are consistent with one another. But they aren't always consistent with one another. There are many situations in which we will behave in a way that contradicts an attitude that we have or a belief that we have. And under those conditions, where there's a contradiction between our behavior and our attitudes, that produces this negative, aversive arousal state. It makes us uncomfortable. We don't like it. And that negative arousal that we experience is known as cognitive dissonance. You can see it in the name, right? Cognitive dissonance means there's a dissonance, there's a disconnect between some sort of cognitive elements like an attitude and a behavior. Okay, so cognitive dissonance arises when we behave in a way that contradicts an earlier attitude that we have. And I'll give you some examples of this in a second. And we don't like cognitive dissonance. It's a very uncomfortable state to be in. And so we are motivated, in other words, to eliminate or to reduce that negative arousal that's created when our behavior doesn't match our attitudes. And that's what cognitive dissonance theory is all about. It's all about the various psychological mechanisms we have to reduce that negative arousal that's produced when our behavior doesn't match our attitudes. Let me give you an example. And by the way, this slide varies just slightly from the slide that's in your notes. I added a couple just minor things here. Okay, so let's imagine the following. Let's imagine that you have an attitude which is, I'm a healthy person. You consider yourself to be a very healthy person. You work out, you watch what you eat, et cetera, et cetera. That's part of your self-concept, right? But your behavior is that you smoke cigarettes. And you know that those things don't really match, right? If you smoke, smoking's unhealthy for your lungs. So it kind of conflicts with your attitude that you're a healthy person. So that might create some cognitive dissonance in you. So let's look at a variety of ways that you might have of reducing that cognitive dissonance. And the 5 ways I'm going to list here are not an exhaustive list. There are additional ways to reduce your cognitive dissonance as well. But these are 5 of the most popular ways. So first off, if the reason that we're experiencing cognitive dissonance is because our attitude and our behavior don't match, well, obviously, to reduce dissonance, we can change our attitude to match our behavior, right? So in other words, if you smoke, then you could come to change your attitude towards admitting that you are not a healthy person. Okay. If you were to adopt that attitude that you're not a healthy person, then the discrepancy would go away, right? And although that's possible in many circumstances, including in some examples I'll show you in the future, this is not, in this specific scenario, this is hard to do, right? Because you might consider yourself to be a healthy person as a fundamental part of your self-concept. And we don't want to change our self-concept all that much generally. And so it's kind of hard to just change your entire self-concept just because you smoke. So in this specific instance, although you theoretically could change your attitude towards this idea that you're not a healthy person, it might be kind of hard to do so. So you might take a different approach. So if you can't change your attitude to match your behavior, maybe what we could do is change our behavior to match our attitude. Well, in that case, that's pretty simple. Stop smoking, right? If you're no longer smoking, there's no longer a conflict between your behavior and your attitudes, and the cognitive dissonance goes away. Now, those are the 2 most obvious ways of reducing dissonance. But as you can see, again, in this example, quitting smoking is not exactly easy, right? You might be addicted to nicotine or whatever. You may just not want to quit. So we also have a number of psychological mechanisms that we use to sort of, you can almost think of it as deluding ourselves or lying to ourselves a little bit to convince ourselves that that discrepancy doesn't really matter all that much. For instance, we could do something known as adding a consonant cognition. Adding a consonant cognition means that we add a belief that is consistent with both the attitude and the behavior. So I'll give you an example. Let's say in this specific situation, you say, well, I'm a healthy person and I smoke, but smoking does help me lose weight, and losing weight is healthy. So in a sense, smoking is kind of healthy in that it helps me lose weight. Okay, so you can see that adding that belief that smoking helps me lose weight is consistent with my attitude that I'm a healthy person, and it's also consistent with my behavior that I smoke. So it kind of acts as a bridge between the attitude and the behavior. And the more of these consonant cognitions that you can add, the more it dilutes the dissonant cognitions. So if smoking helps you lose weight, that sort of dilutes the fact that it's also bad for your lungs, right? A 4th way to reduce cognitive dissonance is to do something known as minimizing the importance of the conflict. In this strategy, what happens is that we acknowledge that there is a conflict between our attitude and our behavior, but we basically convince ourselves that it's not a big deal for whatever reason. So for example, we might say, well, we're all going to die. Even the healthiest person who exercises 10 hours a day and eats nothing but salads, they're going to die at some point as well, right? So if we're all going to die, we might as well enjoy ourselves while we're here. And so I might as well smoke. Okay? So what this person is doing is acknowledging that there is a discrepancy between someone's attitude and their behavior, but saying, you know what, it's not that big a deal that that conflict exists because we're all going to die anyway. A fifth way of reducing dissonance is to reduce your perceived choice. So imagine that you're this person. You think of yourself as a healthy person. If I came to you and put a gun to your head and said, smoke this cigarette, you are going to smoke that cigarette and you're not going to feel bad about it, right? You're not going to like feel guilty about having smoked a cigarette because you were forced to do it. You had no other choice. When we can convince ourselves that we were forced to do this behavior, to engage in some behavior, then we don't have to feel guilty about having done it, right? Because we can convince ourselves we didn't choose to do it, that we had no other option. And so one of the strategies to reduce dissonance is to convince ourselves that we were forced to engage in the behavior that conflicted with our attitude. So in this specific example, you might convince yourself that you were effectively forced to smoke. You can say, well, I had no choice. Everyone else was smoking. They all went on their smoke break at the same time. And if I didn't go with them, they're going to gossip about me. And so I have to go with them. I have to smoke in order to make sure they don't gossip about me. Something along those lines. And if you can convince yourself of that, then you were therefore forced to smoke. You had no option. You had no choice in the matter. You don't have to feel guilty about it effectively. I think you see this a lot with working out, I think, where maybe you get a new gym membership and you're planning on getting healthy and going to the gym, and then you don't use your gym membership for a while. And you say things like, well, you know, I just haven't had time, right? By saying you haven't had time, what you're doing is you're reducing your perceived choice. You're basically saying, well, I had no choice in the matter. I couldn't go because there was literally no time I could have gone to the gym. Now, what happens normally is that there is time, but people are not prioritizing working out in that sense. But by convincing themselves they had no time to go, they can reduce their perceived choice, which reduces the cognitive dissonance that's created. So as I said, this is not an exhaustive list of ways to reduce cognitive dissonance, but these are 5 of the most common ways that people have. Generally, people will take whatever option is is easiest to them at any given time. So in different situations, people may reduce their dissonance in different ways, depending on what's easiest. But if you look for this, you'll see people justifying their behaviors all the time. You'll hear people say things like, you know, I had no choice, or I might as well because this, you know, it doesn't really matter that I did this or whatever. You'll see this all the time. You'll notice it in yourself as well, that you'll be justifying your past actions. Okay, this is something that we've all experienced. I can guarantee that you've experienced this many times, that you will experience this many times. And you can see that cognitive dissonance is all about justifying our past behaviors, right? And all about trying to rationalize them and convincing ourselves that we, in fact, didn't really behave in a way inconsistent with our past attitudes. So you can see like the reason why we tend to kind of lie to ourselves in a sense. Reducing perceived choice reminds me of false consensus. Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. Because you're actually hitting on something bang on. That false consensus is partly a reaction to cognitive dissonance. Because what happens is that, remember, we engage in false consensus for our negative behaviors. So if I drink and drive, then I'll say, well, everybody drinks and drives, right? Well, part of the reason I say that is to reduce the cognitive dissonance associated with me thinking, you know, I'm a careful driver. I'm not going to put anyone at risk, but I'm drinking and driving, right? But if I can convince myself that everyone does it as well, then I'm reducing, or I'm minimizing the importance of the conflict. It's not a big deal that I do it because everyone does it, right? So you can see false consensus as a way of reducing cognitive dissonance. Yeah, that's a really good observation. So there are 3 general domains I'm going to discuss in which we tend to see cognitive dissonance occurring. I'm going to be talking, the way I've talked about it so far is in terms of this first one, where we have to justify our behavior that was discrepant with our attitudes. So I'm going to talk about that in more depth in just a second. Next class on Wednesday, I'm going to talk about justifying effort and justifying difficult decisions. And we're going to see that the same sort of cognitive dissonance process has other implications in these other domains as well. But let's start with number 1 here. Justifying attitude discrepant behavior. That's what we're going to focus on for the rest of today's class. And the first thing I want to do is to describe to you the original cognitive dissonance experiment that demonstrated this for the first time. This is Festinger and Carl Smith, 1959, a very famous paper. And remember, you don't need to know the names of the dates for the exam. So here's the basic idea. I'm going to walk you through this from the perspective of a participant, okay? So I want you to really think about things from their point of view. So you show up to my lab, and I tell you that what I'm going to do, I'm going to place you in a room by yourself. And I've got a task for you to do. And here's what it is. I give you this board, and on this board, there are a bunch of pegs. And I also give you a box, and the box is filled with spools of thread. And what you're going to do is with one hand and one hand only, you're going to reach into the box, you're going to pick up a spool of thread, you're going to place it on the first peg on the board. Go back to the box, pick up another spool of thread, put it on the second peg. You're going to repeat that process over and over until the board is filled with spools of thread. Then you're going to take the first spool of thread off the peg, put it back in the box. Take the second spool of thread off the peg, put it back in the box, repeat that process. And when you're done with that, you're going to do the same thing again and again and again. And for 30 mind-numbingly boring minutes, that's all you do. And you are ready to slit your wrists at the end of this thing. But at the end of 30 minutes, I come in and you're thinking, thank goodness the study's over. And I say, well, no, we're on part 2. Here's what part 2 is. I've got a new board. And on this new board, there's a bunch of cutouts of shapes. And here's a new box. And in this box, there's a bunch of shapes with little pegs on them. And you're going to pick one of these shapes up. And you're going to find its appropriate spot on this board. You're going to put it in the board. And you're going to go back. You're going to pick up another shape, put it in its appropriate slot. And you're going to repeat that process until all these shapes have filled in the board. And when that's done, you're going to take the first shape, you're going to pick it up, you're going to put it back in the box. You're going to take the second shape, pick it up off the board, put it back in the box, repeat that process. And when you're done with that, you're going to repeat it again and again and again. And for another 30 minutes, you're engaged in another mind-numbingly boring task. So for an hour now, you are bored out of your mind. Finally, I come and rescue you. And I say, okay, we're done with the study. Let me debrief you a little bit. So I start to tell you what the study is about. What I say is this. I say, what the study is looking at is the effect of motivational instructions on performance. So some people in the study were given instructions or were told how much fun the study was. And some people like yourself were not. You were in the control condition. You were not told how much fun the study was. At this point, you think the study's over. In fact, the study's just beginning. At this point, the researcher now randomly assigns you to one of 3 conditions. If you're in the control condition, then the researcher simply says, okay, well, before you leave, the university is collecting a bunch of data in terms of, they want to know like how interesting people find these studies, how much fun they are, how much of an educational experience they are, et cetera. So they've got a quick survey for you to fill out if you don't mind. And in that questionnaire are a number of questions, including one that says, how much fun did you find this study? That's going to be our key outcome measure. Okay, so that's if you're in the control condition. If you're in one of the other 2 conditions, then what happens is that after I tell you what the study is supposedly about, I get a phone call in the other room. And I leave and I take the phone call and I come back. And I say, okay, we're in a bit of a weird situation here. It's a bit unorthodox. But here's what happens. The person that called me, that was my research assistant. And they were supposed to be here like right now to run another participant who's in a waiting room. The problem is that my research assistant just got into a minor fender bender. Everything's okay, but they can't make it here on time. And the participant's in the waiting room already. And my research assistant is supposed to tell them how much fun the study is because they're in that condition. I have no one to do this right now. So I was hoping I could ask a favor of you. I was wondering if you would be willing to go into the waiting room and tell that person how much fun that study was that you just did. What I'm basically asking you to do is to lie to that next person, right? I'll tell you what, if you do this for me, I will give you $20. That's one condition. If you're in the 3rd condition, I say, okay, I'll tell you what, if you do this for me, I will pay you $1. Now, even in 1959, $1 wasn't a huge sum of money by any means. But regardless, pretty much everyone in those 2 conditions agrees, okay? So we've got 3 conditions. We've got people who are never asked to lie. We've got people who were asked to lie and say how much fun the study was for $20, and people who were asked to lie and say how much fun the study was for $1. So if you're in one of those last two conditions, you go into the waiting room and there's another participant there, and you strike up a conversation and you say, hey, listen, I heard the study is really fun. And the other person says, what? I've heard it's not fun at all. My roommate did it. They said it was boring. And you say, no, don't listen to them. It was a blast. I had a great time doing it. You're really going to love the study. It's one of the most fun studies I've ever done. And you are lying through your teeth. But it seems to have an effect. You seem to have convinced this person that it's going to be fun. Once you're done your job, you come back and the researcher says, okay, thank you for doing that. Appreciate it. Now the university has a questionnaire they want you to fill out about the educational experience you're getting here. So you fill out that same questionnaire people in the control condition filled out. And so you answer the questions, that, including one that says, how much fun did you have in the study? So these are the critical conditions here. The people who are paid $1 are people who are paid $20 to lie. What Festinger and Carl Smith wanted to know is which of these groups of people, the people who are paid $1 to lie or the people who are paid $20 to lie, which of those two groups of people would come to convince themselves that in fact they really did like the study? Which group of people will later rate the task as more enjoyable? Now, if you ask people prior to the study actually being conducted, what they would have predicted, I think what people would have predicted is they would have said, well, the people who are paid $20 will come to convince themselves of the lie, that the lie is the truth, because the more money they're paid, the more they will come to convince themselves that it's true. That is not, however, what actually happened. I'm realizing my graphs are not showing, so I'm just going to do it this way. Okay. So let me walk you through this. Okay. So we're going to start on the left here. These bars represent people's ratings of how much fun they had in the study. Okay. So the people in the no lie, the control condition, people who never lied to another person, they correctly stated that they hated the study, right? They had no fun. It was boring. They hated it completely. The people in the $20 lie condition also basically said the same thing, that they hated the study. It was incredibly boring. But the people in the $1 condition, they actually kind of like the study. And keep in mind that these people are not responding to these questions out loud in front of someone. They're not lying about it. They're responding privately on a questionnaire. They have really come to convince themselves that in fact, they really did enjoy the study. But why? Why would the $1 lie people come to convince themselves that they love this study? This is where you have to really put yourself into the mindset of these participants. Because these participants thought of themselves as honest people, right? I'm an honest person. But these people were paid to lie, right? People in the $20 and the $1 condition were paid to lie. So there's an attitude, I'm an honest person, which conflicts with my behavior, which is that I lied. That's going to create some cognitive dissonance, right? So what's going to happen here? Well, the $20 people can say, well, yeah, I did lie, which I'm being a bit of a hypocrite here, but you know what? I was paid $20 to do so. I'm comfortable with that. I'm willing to sell out a little bit for money, okay? I have a good reason, this $20, why I lied, so I'm okay with that. But the $1 lie people couldn't do that, right? I mean, think of it. They think they're an honest person and they just lied to someone, and what? They're willing to sacrifice their values and morals for $1? I don't think so, right? So now they're in a bit of a problem because now like their behavior doesn't match their attitude. They're feeling like hypocrites and they can't say they did it for the money. Well, you know what? Actually, now that I think about it, I actually really like this study now that I think about it, right? And so what they did is they convinced themselves they like the study, because if they can convince themselves they like the study, then they weren't lying. There's no longer any inconsistency. They've reduced their cognitive dissonance, in other words, right? So what's happened in this study is that both the people in the $20 lie condition and the $1 lie condition, they experienced cognitive dissonance when their behavior didn't match their attitudes. But the people in the $20 condition had a good reason for why they did it, whereas the people in the $1 condition did not. And so they, in particular, had to justify their decision to lie to someone, which they did by convincing themselves that they actually liked the study. Okay, is that clear to people? Got some yeses? Okay, good. This whole concept of cognitive dissonance hinges on a notion known as sufficient justification. And the basic idea behind sufficient justification is that the greater the reward, or the greater the external motivator for engaging in some behavior that conflicts with an attitude, the less likely your attitude will actually change. What this means is, if you think about people in the original study, the people who were paid $20 to lie, they didn't come to change their attitudes. They correctly recognized they hated the study. It was the people who were only paid $1 who showed attitude change, who had to convince themselves that they really liked the study, right? So contrary to a lot of popular belief, the greater the reward that people get, the less likely attitude is to change for that behavior. So here's what this means, right? So sufficient justification means that this only matters when you engage in a behavior that conflicts with a prior attitude. So I'm an honest person, but I just lied, right? If you have sufficient justification, then what that means is you have a good enough reason for why you lied. You acted contrary to your attitudes, but you know exactly why you did it. You can say, I did it for the money. There's a reason I did it, right? And when we have sufficient justification, and here's the main takeaway, when we have sufficient justification, we do not experience cognitive dissonance, okay? Because we know that we lied for the money, or we know, or whatever it is, right? And that's a good thing, because there are many, many instances in which we engage in behaviors that conflict with our attitudes. Most of us tend to think that we're honest people, right? But we all tend to lie, at least these little white lies, all the time. For instance, let's imagine that you're a bridesmaid for a friend's wedding, and that'll be easier for some of you to imagine that. But let's imagine that you are a bridesmaid in an upcoming wedding, okay? And let's say that the bride has picked out dresses for you. So you go in and you try on your dress, and you come out, and when you come out, the dress looks like this. And the bride asks you, okay, how do you like these dresses that I picked out for you? And you grit your teeth and you say, I love this dress you got for me, right? And you're lying through your teeth, right? Well, you might think of yourself as an honest person, but you're lying here. That would normally produce cognitive dissonance. But you know exactly why you're lying. You're lying because you want to protect your friend's feelings. You don't want her to feel bad on her wedding day. You want her to feel like she made a good choice. So it's justifiable why you're lying. You have sufficient justification for that lie. Therefore, you don't experience cognitive dissonance, okay? So that's a key concept, because there are many, many situations in which we do act contrary to our attitudes, but we don't experience cognitive dissonance because we have sufficient justification for that behavior. I'm not sure what you mean when you say, what about to avoid something we lie? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. But as you type, if you're going to type a response, let me move on as well. The opposite of sufficient justification is insufficient justification. So when we have insufficient justification, that is when we do experience cognitive dissonance. Okay? So insufficient justification occurs when we act in a way contrary to our attitudes, okay, but we don't really know why, or we don't have a good reason to point to as to say that's why I did it. This is like people in the $1 condition, people who basically lied to someone else, but they couldn't say they did it for the money because they were only paid $1. And under those conditions where we can't point to a reason why we did it, now is when we have to convince ourselves that in fact our behavior and our attitude wasn't really inconsistent in the first place. This is when cognitive dissonance kicks in and we feel the psychological need to justify our past behaviors. So this is when we can engage in any one of those 5 cognitive dissonance reduction strategies that I mentioned at the beginning of this section. So for instance, we can change our attitude to match the behavior, which is what happened in the original study, or we can engage in any of the other strategies as well, minimizing the importance of the conflict, reducing perceived choice, etc. Right? So when we have insufficient justification, that's when we engage in cognitive dissonance reduction strategies. Lying to someone about what you did to avoid being scolded. Yeah, so you're hitting on something I'm going to mention in just a minute. You're hitting on something I'm going to mention in a minute when I talk about punishment. But yes, if you can point to a reason and you can say, I did something that contradicts an attitude I have, and you could say I did it for that reason, to avoid being scolded or whatever, then yeah, that would be sufficient justification for that behavior. For the sake of time, again, because we're a little bit behind, I'm going to skip over these first two examples. They're just sort of examples or phenomena in which we see justifying behaviors that I just described. I just don't have time to get into them at the moment, and I'm not going to ask any questions of them on the exam. But I am going to explain cheating as an example of justifying behaviors. Because this was a study where researchers went into a school and they administered a questionnaire to the students in the class that asked them about their attitudes towards cheating. And the kids on average were sort of moderately against cheating. They recognize that it's a bad thing, but it's not like the worst thing in the world you could do, right? So they're sort of moderately against it on average. Then what the researchers did is they had the teacher administer a test to all the kids. And the teacher left the room, giving the kids an opportunity to cheat on that test. And some of the kids cheated and some of the kids didn't cheat. But the researchers were secretly monitoring the kids so they could see which of the kids cheated and which of the kids didn't cheat. And then later on, after that test, the researchers again administer a questionnaire, and one of the questions on the questionnaire is, what is your attitude towards cheating? And the researchers want to know whether the kids' attitudes towards cheating changed as a function of whether they themselves cheated or not. So that's what I'm going to show you on this slide here. Okay, so higher bars means people have a more positive attitude towards cheating. Lower bars means they have a more negative attitude towards cheating. So what the researchers can do is, once they've figured out which of the kids cheated and which of the kids didn't cheat, you can divide them into cheaters and non-cheaters. And you can retrospectively look to see what their attitudes towards cheating were before the test was administered. And on average, the cheaters and the non-cheaters had roughly the same, on average, attitudes towards cheating, okay, before the test. Then the test is administered and the cheaters cheat and the non-cheaters obviously don't cheat. And then what happens is that the cheaters' attitudes towards cheating get even more positive. You can see the gray bar increases here. So in other words, these kids are kids who they just cheated on a test. Then they're asked the question, what is your attitude towards cheating? They say, oh, well, now I think, now I think about it, cheating is really not that bad. It's really not a big deal at all, right? And the reason they're doing that is because they have to justify their prior behavior of having cheated. I mean, after all, if they just cheated 5 minutes ago, and they say, you know what, I'm very much against cheating, that's going to produce a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? That's a big gap between their behavior and their attitude. So what they have to do is convince themselves that cheating's not a big deal at all, right? So their attitude becomes much more permissive towards cheating. And the non-cheaters go through the exact opposite, because the non-cheaters were in a situation where they were able to cheat 5 minutes ago, but they didn't. Well, why didn't they? I mean, if cheating's not a big deal, then why didn't they cheat? So what they said, you know what, cheating's like the worst thing you could possibly do, right? So they get even more negative towards cheating. So what's happening here is people are justifying their prior behaviors. And that's what I mean at the beginning of this section, when I said that under some circumstances, not only do attitudes lead to behaviors, but the behaviors we engage in lead us to adopt attitudes that are consistent with those past behaviors. And we do that to avoid cognitive dissonance. So if you cheat on something, suddenly you get much more accepting of cheating. Okay. Here's another example of some of the implications of cognitive dissonance. So in the study, what researchers did is they had a bunch of 5-year-olds, okay? And then one at a time, they were in this room where there's a bunch of toys and stuff. And there's one particular toy in that room that was really highly desirable to the kids. And I don't know what the toy was, but if it was me, if I was the kid, then this would be the desirable toy. Like this, I kind of want to play with this robot now in my 40s. But regardless, when I was a kid, I would definitely want to play with this robot. So let's just imagine it's this robot, okay? So there's this one really desirable toy, this robot or whatever the kids want to play with. And the researchers tell the kids, they say, I've got to leave the room for a minute. While I'm gone, you see that toy over there? You are not allowed to play with that toy. And at that point, they randomly assign the kids to one of two conditions. In the severe threat condition, they say, see that toy over there? You are not allowed to play with it. And if you touch it, if you play with that toy, you're going to be in such big trouble when I come back. Okay. Or in the mild threat condition, they simply say, see that toy over there? You're not allowed to play with it. And that's it. The researcher then leaves and they secretly monitor the child to see if they play with the toy. But the kids are all good. None of the kids play with that toy. They want to. You can see they're looking at it, but they don't play with it. Then the researchers come back and they ask the kids, how much do you want to play with that toy? Okay, now let's think about what the kids are doing. Okay, what's going through their minds. Okay, so imagine that you've got a kid in. Let's start with the severe threat condition. Right, these kids are thinking, well, I really want to play with that toy. I didn't play with the toy, but you know what? I know exactly why I didn't play with the toy. I didn't play with the toy because of that severe threat. Right. In other words, what I'm saying is that they had sufficient justification for why their behavior didn't match their attitudes. Right. And as we know, if we have sufficient justification for why our behavior doesn't match our attitudes, we don't experience cognitive dissonance. So when you ask those kids who in the severe threat condition, do you want to play with a toy? They correctly say, yeah, I really want to play with that toy. Right? But the key is what happens to the kids in the mild threat condition. These kids also don't play with the toy. And when they're later asked, okay, do you want to play with that toy? They're thinking, well, I want to play with that toy. I didn't play with the toy a few minutes ago. Why did I not play with the toy? Well, obviously it wasn't about the threat because the threat was only mild, right? So why did I not play with the toy? And they start thinking, well, actually, I never wanted to play with the toy at all. I don't really want to play with the toy at all. That's why I didn't play with it, right? I didn't play with it because I never wanted to play with it. So the toy became less attractive to the kids in the mild threat condition because they convinced themselves they never wanted to play with it anyway. It's sort of an important concept because if you think about, like, if you're a parent, for instance, and you want to keep your kid from doing something they shouldn't be doing, you normally think that the common sense notion is to threaten them with severe punishment if they do it. So let's say you have a teenager, okay? That teenager is going to a party and you're afraid they're going to drink and they shouldn't be drinking. And your temptation might be to say, if you touch alcohol, I'm going to ground you for months. You're going to be in such big trouble, right? Now that threat might be enough to get that kid to not drink, but the kid's going to know they want to drink. They know the only reason they're not drinking is because of that threat you gave them. But here's sort of the more sophisticated technique that you should use psychologically, is you use a mild threat, right? So you say, I know you're going to a party, there's going to be alcohol, and I really don't want you to drink there. And as long as that mild threat is strong enough to keep them from drinking, then what's going to happen is what's going to happen to the kids that were in the mild threat condition. The teenager's not going to drink, again, assuming the mild threat is enough to keep them from drinking. And they're going to start to try to rationalize why they're not drinking, right? It's not because of the threat. So what they're going to do is they might convince themselves, I'm not drinking because I didn't want to drink in the first place. And they've internalized it now, right? So now they've convinced themselves they don't actually want to drink, which is the very thing that you as a parent are trying to instill in them. So again, what this is showing is that these harsh punishments aren't really that effective, that milder forms of punishment tend to be more effective. In part because it's the milder form of punishments that leads people to internalize these ideas, whereas the severe forms of punishment don't. Okay, any questions on cognitive dissonance so far? Good, I'm glad to hear that your mind's blown. Again, this is such an important theory, and I've only talked about one aspect of it so far. We're going to talk about other aspects of it later on. I mean, when this theory came out, it changed the field of social psychology. People made their careers off testing various implications of cognitive dissonance theory, in part because the theory is so rich, it led to so many predictions that it led to just a flood of studies of people testing various ideas that come out of it. Just confirm the original study of dissonance was an example of insufficient justification. Well, it had both. So the original study of cognitive dissonance had the $20 people had sufficient justification because they had $20. That was reason enough for them to lie. So they didn't experience cognitive dissonance. And the people in the $1 condition, that $1 was not enough for them to lie. And so they had to justify it some other way. They had insufficient justification and they did experience cognitive dissonance. So basically $1 is the equivalent of insufficient justification. $20 condition is the equivalent of sufficient justification. So it's not quite the same thing as over-justification, although I can see that there are some similarities there. Over-justification just has to do with people's intrinsic motivation to perform a task. Well, okay, actually, it's a little more complicated than that. For reasons that I can't get into now, but I can get into on Wednesday, there is actually a link between cognitive dissonance and over-justification, but it works through a self-perception process that I haven't quite explained yet. Basically, the basic idea is that on Wednesday, I'm going to talk about an alternative theory that arose about 12 years or so after cognitive dissonance theory was published, in which they explain all of these effects using a different mechanism. And that different mechanism can be used to explain over-justification. So although this is kind of complex and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense now, it should make a little bit more sense when after class on Wednesday. So we'll get back to that idea. So let's have a quiz. How about that? And then we'll come back to talking about 2 other domains of cognitive dissonance theory on Wednesday. So open up your Top Hat accounts. And I'll give you a minute to get into those accounts. This is quiz 3. And let's get started. Okay. People from Western cultures, like the US, learn to make more and more of what kind of attributions as they grow up? Do they make more situational, dispositional, contextual, or external attributions? And don't worry, we're waiting for you, Erica. Okay, got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we talked a lot in the attribution section about how we will sometimes make situational attributions, sometimes we make internal attributions, and we talked in Western cultures about how we tend to make a lot of internal attributions for other people's behavior. So what I'm really, and then we learn to make those attributions over time. So what I'm really asking is, which of these 4 types of attributions is a synonym for an internal attribution? And so that would be B, dispositional attribution. So these are a little rough. So if you think of the terms situational, contextual, and external are all synonyms. They're all explaining people's behavior in terms of something external to the person, something in the situation, the context, etc. That's something external to the person. If you're explaining someone's behavior in terms of something internal to the person, something about their attitude or their disposition, that would be a dispositional attribution. Okay, so make sure that you study up for that for the exam. Yeah, if your Top Hat is giving you an error, then, well, first off, you can always text your responses if you need to. And secondly, just come see me at the end of class, and then I can take care of it manually. Okay. You guys will do better on these, I think. Most attitude researchers believe that attitudes have 3 components. These components are which of the following, and I'll let you guys read those for yourself. Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned that. Thanks for mentioning that, Mohammed. For the first question, that was in reference to the attributions we make of others. Yeah, so in general, when we talk about attributions, we typically mean the attributions we make for other people. If we're talking about attributions we make for ourselves, I'll specify that. But the default is the attributions we make for other people. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about the ABCs of the self, and we talked about the ABCs of attitudes as well. And the ABCs, of course, refer to the affective, behavioral, and cognitive components of attitudes. So that is D. Implicit attitudes can be difficult to measure because why? Is it because people are not aware of having them? Because they can only be measured by direct techniques? Because they become aggregated over time? Or because they are prone to the effects of social desirability? You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Well, we talked about how people can have either implicit or explicit attitudes. Explicit attitudes are the attitudes we're aware of, and implicit attitudes are the attitudes we are not aware of having, therefore making them somewhat difficult to measure. So A is the correct answer there. Question, I think we're on 4. The purpose of a bogus pipeline is to do which of the following? Is it to avoid confounds when manipulating the independent variable, to reduce the likelihood of making the fundamental attribution error, to reduce the likelihood that participants will lie about their attitudes, or to measure attitudes and behaviors at the same level of specificity? You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we talked about a bogus pipeline. That's when it's a way to minimize social influence because the concern is that people are going to lie about what their true attitudes are. So when you hook people up to a bogus pipeline, you're hooking them up to basically a fake lie detector test. And if people believe that lie detector test is real, that means they're less likely to lie about their attitudes, which is option C. And incidentally, that is largely how actual lie detectors work. Lie detectors don't actually detect lies. They detect changes in your anxiety levels and things like that, which could be because of lying and could be because of other things as well. But what happens is that if people believe that this lie detector can detect their lies, then they're going to be more honest with the person who's asking them questions, right? So lie detectors partly work because people believe that they work, and therefore they are less likely to lie themselves. But that's why they're not admissible in courts and things like that, because they're just inherently unreliable in general. Okay, question 5. Based on social psychological research, which of the following statements is true? A, our attitudes and our behaviors are unrelated. B, our attitudes determine our behavior, but our behavior does not determine our attitudes. C, our behavior determines our attitudes, but our attitudes do not determine our behavior. Or D, under certain circumstances, attitudes do predict behavior. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, well, this was kind of the main question that we were addressing in the attitude section. And despite some research initially showing that there was no relationship between attitudes and behaviors, we did eventually discover that under certain circumstances, attitudes do predict behaviors. That's option D. Okay, well, we've got like 4 minutes left. If anyone has any other questions about cognitive dissonance theory or anything else, I can take them now. And I'll give you guys a minute if you're typing in questions. Keeping in mind that, of course, this will be on the exam, and also that the first assignment that I will be giving you will be based on your understanding of cognitive dissonance theory as well. So keeping that in mind, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them now. I'm not seeing anything. So if no one has any questions, then you guys are free to leave. I'll hang out for a few minutes for people with top hat issues and I'll correct those. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Wednesday, which will be over Zoom as well. So I'll see you guys then. And the study guide, yes, thanks for reminding me. The study guide has been posted onto Canvas right before class. I did that, so it should be viewable to everybody. All right, guys, have a good one. Bye.